on where you will, what you will learn, how you will intervene, and where you will take the country. So it's really absolutely wonderful to be here, and I want to congratulate the AMU students of the History Department and various other departments who are part of this very, very lovely initiative, and I hope that this can be sustained and that you will have many such discussions, because after all, discussions, critical inquiry is at the very center of a university. Even if the university places constraints, as we have been told that there are constraints, and that is the case everywhere. AMU is not an exception, but yet I think what is very wonderful is that there are discussions happening in all universities. In my own university, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which has also started a JNU lecture series, and there are numerous, and one of the organizers, M.F.K.SIDDIQUI, who started this, is very much here, and I think the success of that program probably inspired the AMU lecture series. So it's very nice that that you're having such a discussion, and also thank you so much for so many of you to turn up here for this discussion. Now, Professor Sajjad has also very nicely laid out the broad contours of this theme and the discussion. My brief is to broaden it a little further and to really focus, as I told Firdaus, that I will focus more broadly on majoritarianism. So I want to address a challenge that is neither abstract nor theoretical, but existential to Indian democracy: the rise of majoritarian politics, and more specifically, the systematic othering of minorities as a means of consolidating permanent political power. This challenge does not merely affect electoral outcomes or party competition. It strikes at the foundational question of who belongs to the nation, who counts as a political subject, and whose rights are treated as expendable in the pursuit of dominance. At its core, majoritarianism is the claim that a nation's political destiny should be determined exclusively by its ethnic or religious majority. While democracy necessarily involves majority rule, majoritarianism goes further. It transforms numerical strength into entitlement, cultural supremacy, and political permanence. It is not simply a method of decision-making, but an ideology of control in which the majority comes to see itself as synonymous with the nation. In this sense, majoritarianism does not abandon democracy outright, but reshapes it from within. It claims legitimacy through elections while hollowing out equality, invokes national unity while institutionalizing exclusion, and sustains itself by producing internal enemies against whom the majority must be mobilized. Now, this trajectory is not unfamiliar to South Asia. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Myanmar have all succumbed to majoritarian impulses, and some of them in the very early decades of their independence. Sri Lanka defined itself as a modern, pluralistic, secular democracy, yet Sinhala Buddhist nationalism delegitimized Tamil political claims, and that generated intolerance, violence, and many decades of civil war. Pakistan, of course, from its inception, defined itself as an Islamic nation, defining national identity through religious affiliation, marginalized its minorities, and ultimately that fractured the state with the secession of Bangladesh. And currently, as we speak, Bangladesh is clearly gripped by Muslim majoritarianism, or one might say Islamic majoritarianism. Myanmar is perhaps one of the worst cases of majoritarianism in that it represents a more extreme case where Buddhist majoritarianism has enabled ethnic cleansing and the near erasure of the Rohingya people, who are really now a nowhere people. So now such majoritarian politics then, which makes religion central to the identity of a nation, deeply damages its economic and political prospects, and we can see that clearly in the case of some of the states that I mentioned, most notably, of course, Pakistan and Myanmar, and obviously now to an extent Bangladesh as well. Now, India's trajectory is fascinating in that it initially diverged from this South Asian pattern and to a considerable extent continues to do so. Despite partition along religious lines, India formally embraced the separation of religion and state, treating pluralism and diversity as intrinsic values rather than mere social facts. Under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, the post-independence state adopted a consciously secular and pluralist model of governance. India's democratic experiment represented a definitive rejection of majoritarianism in contrast to its neighbors. The architects of the Indian Constitution established equal citizenship as the foundation of the new state, conceiving democracy as explicitly pluralist, grounded in the principle that no single community, howsoever large, could claim ownership of the nation. Accordingly, India's deep and structurally embedded diversity was not erased, but politically accommodated through constitutional protection of rights, protection of religious freedoms, minority rights, and above all, linguistic pluralism through the linguistic reorganization of states. Now, democracy endured because the state refused to identify itself with any single religion or culture. Political power was instead fragmented, negotiated, and constrained by institutions designed to prevent the tyranny of the majority. Now, for decades after independence, the Indian National Congress functioned as an umbrella party that balanced caste, religion, language, and regional interests. This settlement, however, came apart. It came under increasing strain from the early 1990s amid growing communal polarization. As the Congress weakened ideologically and organizationally, the space it once occupied was filled by a more explicit and assertive majoritarian politics. And sadly, the demolition of the Babri Masjid marked a decisive rupture in India's post-independence political order, accelerating the transition from civic nationalism to assertive majoritarianism. What had earlier been a contested ideological current, and sure, that current was always there and it's been there for more than 100 years now. So what had earlier been a contested ideological current acquired mass support through the Ayodhya movement, which framed political power as the rightful inheritance of the majority community. By mobilizing religious symbols and narratives of historical grievance, this movement recast democracy as majority rule. It weakened the separation between religion and state and promoted the idea of a majoritarian nation state. Now, this transformation or the shift, maybe transformation is overstating it, and it gives it a positive meaning. I would say the shift was consolidated in the 2014 general election when the current ruling party secured an absolute majority, the first in 3 decades and the first for a party rooted in a majoritarian ideology. Its re-election in 2019 marked the transition from the electoral victory to ideological entrenchment. And majoritarianism then became not merely a strategy of mobilization as it seemed in the 2014 elections, but a governing principle by 2019 aimed at remaking the Indian state by fusing religious identity with nationalism. Since 2019 then, this vision has been translated into policy, politics and mobilization, and the application of Article 370, which removed the special constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir, it subordinated federalism and also sidelined consent to majoritarian authority. Now, and then of course, the second landmark was the Citizenship Amendment Act, again in 2019, which introduced religion as a criterion for citizenship for the first time in independent India, and that was another blow at the secular basis of political belonging. Now, together these measures signaled a decisive shift from keeping religion out of politics to a religiously inflected politics and nationhood. And of course, the culmination of this shift was the construction of the Grand Ram Temple in Ayodhya and the Supreme Court verdict, but more importantly, followed by the participation of the state and its top leaders, notably the Prime Minister himself, in the inaugural ceremony. I think publicly aligned state power with religious nationalism. And in fact, it was celebrated by supporters as rivaling the independent state in significance. And this moment was crystallized. This moment then crystallized the fusion of majoritarianism with political authority and also signaled once again that the nation belongs to a certain community. Now, majoritarianism operates not only through law and policy, but also through the reorganization of power. And that is what we have witnessed in the past, 11 or 12 years, and particularly the past 5 or 6 years. So centralization has been a defining feature of this phase, and this is inseparable from majoritarian logic. Once the majority is presumed to be unified and authoritative, institutional checks appear unnecessary or obstructive. Parliament becomes a site of ratification rather than debate. Federalism is reinterpreted as conditional autonomy, and independent institutions are expected to align with the dominant political narrative. In practice, but that is the interesting thing about majoritarianism in India, that it has been accompanied by the weakening of constitutional restraints without any formal suspension of the constitution or the suspension of democracy. This is very different from the emergency of 1975 to 77, which, and I would differentiate the present phase from that of the emergency. That was an authoritarian phase. This is different because it is not only authoritarian, it is also majoritarian. It would be incomplete to call it only authoritarian. It is a majoritarian, authoritarian phase, unlike the emergency, which had no ethnic dimension, which had no communal dimension. This shift has unfolded through legal and ethnic means and through a parliamentary majority and judicial acquiescence, giving it a durability far beyond what we could have imagined a few years ago by advancing this project from within the institutional and electoral domains. So institutional complicity then is a very important part of this process, most notably through the normalization of state involvement in overtly religious projects. And the cumulative effect has been the ethnicization of the state, where the majority will be accorded preferential treatment and minority protections are rendered expendable. Now, central to this term in our politics is what we are gathered here to discuss, and that is the systematic production of otherness or othering, particularly of the minority communities, but particularly of Muslims, through a discourse of victimhood and retribution. Now, despite their marginal presence in political and state institutions, Muslims are projected as historical oppressors and contemporary beneficiaries of appeasement. As the Italian philosopher Umberto Eco observes in his book Inventing the Enemy, and I quote, portraying something as a true threat before a population, even if it does not directly threaten them, has always been a political strategy in politics and electoral politics. What is at stake, he argues, is not merely the familiar act of identifying an enemy, but the deliberate process of producing and demonizing one. So one of the consequences of this othering is the systematic exclusion of Muslims from the public sphere. Despite constituting over 14% of the population, they are absent from public life today, and they're the most underrepresented community in parliament, in state legislatures, in public institutions, and in positions of authority. But above all, and as a student of politics, and I'm sure many of you are students of contemporary history and politics, I think as the Bharatiya Janata Party's electoral dominance has expanded, Muslim political presence has sharply declined. And some excellent work by the French political scientist Christophe Jaffalo, along with his colleagues, has actually demonstrated a clear relationship between the rise of BJP and the systematic political underrepresentation of Muslims. So and I think what it signals then is that, so as I was saying, as the BJP's electoral dominance has expanded, Muslim political presence has sharply declined, signaling that power can be secured without their support. And as a result, political parties across the spectrum now hesitate to field Muslim candidates, fearing accusations of appeasement, and often confine giving tickets to them in a very small number of constituencies which have a high Muslim population. That was not the case earlier, which is not to say that they were not underrepresented. But I think what we are witnessing now is something different from the past. Now, the ruling party's refusal, and that's the point, the ruling party's refusal to nominate even a single Muslim legislator in several states or in parliament from 2014 reflects a deliberate strategy of rendering them electorally irrelevant and publicly invisible. In successive elections, the ruling party has secured majorities in parliament without a single Muslim member of parliament in either house, and without their representation in state assemblies. And we know now they are governing 21 state assemblies. Now this exclusion extends obviously beyond electoral politics into government, civil services, judiciary, and so on and so forth. But this pattern of exclusion that we are witnessing in India is exceptional in comparative democratic terms. Even right-wing parties in other countries which are criticized for prejudice, for racism elsewhere, maintain minority representation. For example, Britain's Conservative Party, despite its hostile rhetoric on immigration, has elevated Muslim politicians and is currently led by Kenny Badenoch, who is a black woman, who's the leader of the opposition in the United Kingdom. I mean, that is now almost unthinkable in India. In the United States, the Republican Party has black senators and representatives alongside prominent politicians of Indian descent. So the complete absence of Muslim representation here in the ruling party departs from the patterns of representation in right-wing parties that has been observed in other countries, and this reflects a very deliberate kind of exclusionary politics. Now, the majoritarian logic extends to beyond religious minorities, to political opponents who are routinely recast as anti-national, and critics are described as people who can destabilize the nation, and so on.